Good morning from Silver Spring, North Carolina. How's everybody doing today? It is April 5th. We are now into the last month of class. Yay. April Fool's Day is over. The Tar Heels lost a tough game last night in the national championship, but I'm okay and I'm over it. And we are ready to finish out the rest of this semester. I guess everybody knows that it is exam week. So we have an exam this weekend, and tax day is coming up in less than 2 weeks. So we have got a lot of stuff going on this semester. This week. Everybody doing well today? Hi, Rasha. Good to see you, Deerica. Good to see you. Hopefully you've got your tax payments in order or are working on them. Hopefully you're ready for the third exam, which is coming up this week. Hi, Sarah. Good to see you. Looks like we have a good class today. I've got Ashley, Courtney, Eli, Andrea, Deerica, Rasha, Imani. Good to see you. Thanks for coming today. Hi, Sarah. All right. Anybody have any questions, any problems, any thoughts? Oh, you know what I forgot to do? Hold on just a second. I was wondering why my image didn't look as crisp as it was supposed to. I forgot to turn my lights on this morning. That's better. I'm like teaching in the dark. Okay, so we are chapter 12. This third exam is going to cover chapters 9, chapter 10, chapter 11, chapter 12. We do have a review session Friday morning at 9 a.m. and the link is already in the exams folder. You know, the exam will be available Friday morning at 9 a.m., of course. Okay, so let's see. Uh-oh. Why are my fast keys not working? Uh-oh. Hold on, folks. Wonder why my hotkeys aren't working. Hold on just a second. Let's see, hotkeys. PowerPoint, okay. Let's see, screen share, video, whiteboard, intro. For some reason, I can't get my slide. Where's my PowerPoint? Show, hide, boo. Hold on just a second, folks. I don't know what is wrong. Oh. Okay, let me see. Okay, let's see if that works. Oh, I know what happened. I know exactly what happened. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I should have checked this a little bit closer. Oh, open. Okay, there we go. Now we're good to go. All right. Excuse me. I am so sorry about that. All right, let's get started with today's lecture. I was messing around with stuff earlier and I messed it up. Okay, so we're talking this week about social psychology. What we're going to talk about is what social psychology studies. We're going to talk a little bit about attributional styles, and then we're going to talk about how groups impact our behavior. Thank you all for being so patient to begin with. Okay, social psychology is the science of group functioning. That's what I'm interested in. Now, to this point, we've been talking about human beings as if they were individuals. And yes, they are individuals. They have personalities, they have memories, short term, long term memories. They have a certain level of intelligence that can be measured by an IQ test. There are lots of individual qualities that we can talk about. We can talk about stress and how individuals deal with stress. But you know what? Human beings are not individual characters. They are group animals. We are group animals. So you can't just look at a human being in an individual setting. You have to understand how human beings work together as groups. And there are fundamental underlying principles that determine how human beings function in groups. Just like there are fundamental principles which explain how the mind works, there are fundamental principles which explain how the group affects how the mind works. We can study these, they are scientific, and they can be said to be part of our social DNA, if you will. So, social psychology is the scientific study of how the real or imagined presence of other people affects the way we feel, the way we think, and the way we behave. I'm looking for universal group processes. Now, I'm not interested in how your culture works compared to my culture, works compared to a third culture. This is not cultural psychology. Cultural psychologies look at how cultures differ and shape people's psychological processes. We're looking for the universal processes that underlie all cultures. How do groups function in all cultures? So, social psychology is not cultural psychology. Now, also, social psychology is not sociology. Sociology talks about how the structure of social institutions shape our processes. So, how does schools work? How do jobs work? How does capitalism versus socialism work? Social psychology is not interested in that either. We're looking for universal group processes that function within these structures. So, what are the similarities between a socialism and and capitalism as underlying group systems? So, we're interested in how groups function and how they affect the way we feel, the way we think, and the way we behave. All right. So, each and every one of you is affected by your friend group that you belong to. You're affected by your perceived lack of inclusion in a group. When you start making decisions, depending upon what the initial opinion of your group is, your group's reasoning will travel down a predictable pathway. There are lots of systematic ways in which you are affected by the groups that you perceive yourself to be in. Now, what do social psychologists look at? They look at how people try to understand other people's motives. We're going to talk about attributions today. They also talk about group identity. How does being in a group change the way you think or feel about yourself as an individual? How do groups persuade our attitudes to change? So, all of you change your attitudes based upon whether or not you see yourself to be Republican or Democrat or independent or African American or Hispanic. Your attitudes are affected by the groups that you belong to. And you know what? We're going to talk about the ways in which group members actually affect one another's behavior. Have you ever been talked into doing something you didn't want to do because of some sort of social bond you had with another person? Social psychologists are interested in that. You know what? One of the most important groups that you'll ever be in is the group of you and your romantic partner. So, social psychologists talk about the factors that affect how we are attracted to and build relationships with other people. And then the newest branch of social psychology, probably 40 years old now, 30 or 40 years old now, it's not so new, is social cognition. And how does a group actually affect the way we process information, how we come to decisions? So, there are a lot of ways in which groups can affect the way we think, feel, and behave. The first thing I wanted to talk about today were attributions. An attribution is any explanation, any causal explanation that you try to give to something that happens in your life. I had a friend that was rude to me last week. Why was he rude to me? Was it something about him? Was it something about the situation we were in? Why did my friend do that particular thing? And we make attributions about ourselves. Why was I successful on that test? Why did I fail on that test? Why did I engage in that particular behavior? And so attributions are the explanations we try to assign for the events that occur in our life. It helps us understand the world and make the world more predictable. Why was she nice to me? Why did I fail that test? Now, you can think of attributions as being of two broad types, situational attributions and personal or dispositional attributions. I think your book's going to call them personal attributions. I learned them many years ago as being called dispositional attributions. So if I use those two words interchangeably, they mean the same thing, okay? I think sometimes I do that on the homework and quiz. Don't be fooled if I accidentally do that, okay? So there are two general types of attributions, the situational attribution and the personal attribution. Situational attribution says that the behavior occurred because something about a person's situation. Why was Pete rude to me? Well, Pete was having a bad day. He's under a lot of pressure because he has a tax bill coming up that he can't pay. Pete had just had a fight with his wife, and so he's in an angry space. That's why Pete was mad to me. That's what we would call a situational attribution. You could also make a situational attribution about something that happened to you. Why did I pass that test? Well, that test was really easy. That's a situational attribution. That doesn't say anything about me. That makes an attribution about the situation. Or I could say something like, I got lucky. That's something about the situation. So, one way we explain why things happen is by giving power over to the situation. The other way is to make what's known as a personal or dispositional attribution. Why was Pete rude to me? Because Pete is a rude person in general. Why was that waiter rude to me? Because that waiter was a rude person. Why did I pass that test? Well, because I'm a smart person, because I studied hard, because I was prepared. These are all what we call personal or dispositional attributions. Tina was angry because she is an impatient person. Now, here's the crazy thing. When we use attributions, we kind of do them in a very systematic way. We have a pattern of using these dispositional or personal and situational attributions. Um, Probably the most common one is what's known as the fundamental attributional error. One of the things that we tend to do more than anything else is when people engage in behaviors, we tend to attribute their behavior to their actual dispositions or personalities a lot more frequently than we really should. People's situations affect the way they behave every day. Each and every one of you is either having a good day or a bad day. You've just gotten into a fight or you just won some money. Each and every one of us has situations that affect the way we do things each and every day. Think about how often you're rude or you're nice or you're impatient or you're relaxed. And a lot of times it's the situation that causes you to do that. However, when we estimate other people's behavior, we almost always overestimate the amount that their personality affects their behavior. This is what's known as the fundamental attribution error. I'm sure all of you have had experiences where you've run into professors who have been rude or snappy or impatient with you. And you've probably suggested, you know what, that teacher is a jerk. I don't like that teacher. That teacher is mean. What you underestimate is the effect that that teacher's situation has on their behavior. Maybe they've heard this request 3 times already today. Maybe their boss is asking for a report that they haven't finished. Maybe they're just not having a great teaching day. And so we tend to underestimate the effect that situation has on people's behavior. This is what's known as the fundamental attribution error. Now, this is part and parcel of a larger pattern that we tend to go through, known as the actor observer bias. Not only do we tend to overestimate the effect that people's personalities have on their behavior, we tend to overestimate the degree to which our behavior is a function of our situation. Good morning, William. We're talking about attributions, which are the reasons that people give for why things happen. And I was just telling the class that we tend to overestimate the degree to which other people's behaviors are affected by their personalities, known as the fundamental attribution error. And we tend to underestimate the effect that our personality has on our behavior. So we tend to make situational attributions about our own behavior. And this is known as the actor observer bias. So people have a great tendency to push blame away from themselves by saying it's the situation that made me do that. But whenever somebody treats us rudely, we almost always tend to suggest that it's because that person is like that. Now, we also use attributions in what's known in a self-protective function. There's this thing called the just world hypothesis. Typically, when bad things happen to people, we tend to find a reason to blame them for their bad luck. That female was sexually assaulted. Oh, really? Well, I'll bet she was dressed provocatively. I'll bet she was being flirtatious. I'll bet she was walking in the wrong place at night and shouldn't have been there. It was her fault. It was her fault. It was her fault. We hear about some person getting robbed. Maybe another stereotypic behavior is that a friend of mine got robbed. Oh, yeah. Well, was he flaunting his money? I'll bet he was wearing an expensive watch. I'll bet he was wearing an expensive jewelry. We are putting blame on people for the bad things that happen to them. This is what's known as the just world hypothesis. And if you think about it, attributions help make the world more predictable. If I know that your behavior is a function of your personality, then that makes you more predictable. If I know that bad things only happen to people when they are doing bad things, it allows me to make my world more predictable and safe for me. If I say that my behavior is a function of my situation, then I can escape the consequences to my ego for me being a jerk every day, right? I can always say it was this situation. So attributions sort of help protect our ego and allow us to make our social interactive world just a little bit more predictable, if you will. All right. Now, here's the deal. We also tend to organize the world in terms of groups. And you would be surprised at how easy it is to turn your sense of groupness on or off. And you can talk about all the things that we talk about in terms of bad things, social evils are actually just parts and parcel of group functioning. Prejudice, negative feelings or beliefs towards a member of another group. So, prejudice, you can think of it as just a negative evaluation of people who belong to a different group. Stereotypes, we throw that word around. You know what? That's just an oversimplification of the qualities of a member of another group. Do you folks remember when we talked about schemas, an organized set of associations about a concept that help us understand and organize that concept? Stereotypes are nothing but a schema about another group. So I'll bet if I say Russians, a certain set of associations pop up in your head. If I say Chinese, a certain set of associations pop up in your head. If I say Caucasian or male, any of these group labels is going to carry with it a set of associations. We call these things stereotypes, but social psychologists would just call them group schemas, if you will. And discrimination is an unjustified, inappropriate treatment of people based on group identification. In social psychology, we would just say people tend to show in group favoritism. They treat their in group better than their out group. So let's think about this. We can group ourselves in terms of groups that we belong to or groups that we don't belong to. Social categorization theory says that we have in groups and out groups. Now, the weird thing is a group label can change at any given moment. Okay, um, so, and so these groups depend upon the situation. If I'm with a bunch of men and a female walks in, suddenly the most important grouping in my mind becomes men versus women. Conversely, if I'm sitting in with a group of Caucasians and all of a sudden an Asian or an African American walks in, suddenly race becomes the most important group in my name. Have any of you ever been in a group where you're either the only female or the only male or the only African American or the only Caucasian? Have you ever been in a situation where suddenly group becomes a salient factor in your mind? And that's actually a question. Have any of you ever had that experience? I remember, uh, I remember being in a convenience store one time, and it was just me and the clerk, who was African American, and I was Caucasian, and I didn't think anything about it. And suddenly, another African American walked in the door, and they talked, said hello in kind of a familiar way, and all of a sudden, I had this great sense of my ethnicity. All of a sudden, it's almost like group just became an important thing in my mind. So the weird thing is, people have what we might call a group identity. We tend to have a group identity. Now, this group identity is not always an important part of your psychological functioning. Sometimes your group identity is turned on or off, depending upon what the situation looks like. Like I said, if it's everybody who looks just like you won't be thinking about yourself as a group member. But suddenly, if you put on a Carolina sweatshirt and go to a basketball game and see those state fans over there and you're wearing a Carolina sweatshirt, suddenly the most important thing that occurs in your mind is that you are a part of a group. So human beings can define themselves as individuals or groups. And when we do, we tend to break the world up into in groups and out groups. And your sense of groupness is always shifting. Up, I'm thinking about being a male versus a female. Up, I'm thinking about being an American versus a foreign student. Up, I'm thinking about being Caucasian instead of African American. Up, I'm thinking about being a Southerner as opposed to being a Northerner. So throughout the day, you may have senses of your group identity activated in your brain. And we tend to break the world up into in groups and out groups. Now, the second part of that is we tend, just like each and every one of us wants to feel good about our individual self, when our group self is activated, we want to feel good about our group self. And so and we treat our group self as an extension of our individual self. So I'm thinking about Chris Roddenberry and I'm wanting to take care of just Chris Roddenberry. But suddenly I walk into a room and there's 14 females and only one other male. Suddenly I'm thinking about, wow, part of my identity is male and I want to take care of my in group. This guy becomes a part of myself, so to speak. And people are motivated to maintain positive feelings towards the self. And since the group can be a part of the self, we tend to have this inherent tendency whenever our groupness is activated to reward that. Okay? It is absolutely impossible, William. And the weird thing is, yourself is just this belief you have about who you are. And at any moment, you can be thinking about your individual self qualities, or you can be thinking about your group self qualities. And what I would say as a social psychologist is we can't help it. We can't help it that we have stereotypes. We can't help it that we have a little bit of discrimination because we tend to want to favor the in group. And in fact, this fellow named Henry Tajfel, he actually ran from Jordan. He was a Jewish escapee from World War II who then became famous studying groups. He used to have this thing called the minimal group paradigm. He would bring people into a laboratory, 6 people into a laboratory. He would send them to different rooms so that they did not meet the other people in the experiment. He would show them a picture of dots. He would either do that or he would do abstract art. And he would have them evaluate these abstract art things. And he would then put them into what he called a minimal group. Hey, you have been put into a group with person A, B, and C. And all 3 of you are in a group because you overestimated the amount of dots on the screen. And the other 3 people underestimated the dots on the screen. He would then give these people a chance to award points to themselves, their group members, and people outside their group members. And he found even when people weren't sure why they were in a group, even when they hadn't met their group members, even when they had no idea what their group was about, people tended to award more points, more money, and more value to their in group members than their out group members. Okay, so William, think about all the important groups that we have. I mean, race, gender, these are really, really important groups. But I could actually break you up in the class by saying some of you are wearing red shirts today and some of you are wearing green shirts. And based upon that small grouping, I could cause you to start treating people in your group differently than other groups. Okay? And there's this weird thing called the outgroup homogeneity effect. Whenever we're asked to judge members of our in group and our out group, okay, we will always say people in our in group are so different from one another. We're all individuals. We're all different. Members of that out group, oh, they're all alike. They're all similar. So you get a group of men together and we'll say, wow, yeah, us guys, we're all different from one another, but all women are just alike. All women are just alike. You get a group of females together and they'll be sitting talking amongst one another saying, yes, women are so different from each other. Each and every woman is different, has this different personality. But you know what? Men are all alike. And the same thing if you were to sit in a group of African Americans and talk about Caucasians, or if you were in a group of Caucasians and we're talking about Asian students, we all have this tendency whenever we think about people who are in an out group, we tend to think of them as being homogenous, very similar to one another. And so, doesn't that sound like the root of what we would call prejudice and stereotypes? Before you can have a generalized belief of a group, you have to believe that all members of that group are similar. Before you can treat a group poorly, you have to have an idea of which group you belong to and which group you don't belong to. So I would argue to you that the things that discrimination, stereotypes, and prejudice are almost part of the social fabric that makes up the way we think. Okay? When we were born, we learned to divide the world into groups we belong to and groups we don't belong to. And even though we can be in different groups, any one of those groups becomes activated in our mind at any given time. And that will cause us to have different patterns in how we evaluate people from these different groups, right? So you get one man and one woman together, put them in a room and have them work together. They may never think about gender or sex stereotypes. You get a group of men and a group of women together and put them together. Suddenly, gender stereotypes will become very relevant in everyone's head. Okay? Now, groups and their effect on our beliefs. So the weird thing is, these groupings, these group identities that we have, can sometimes affect our behavior. Now, this is where the class sort of veers over into the study of prejudice and discrimination. In fact, if you'll look at the history of social psychology, it is largely related to the study of prejudice, racism, and other horrible acts that have been perpetuated by one group on another group. Psychologists have always been interested in trying to understand the root of this negative behavior. So you're going to see that the study of social psychology kind of intertwines with individual rights and sort of some of the social ills that we think about. Self-fulfilling prophecy. A fellow named Robert Rosenthal showed over many years in research at Harvard that your beliefs about me as a group member will affect how well I perform as a human being. So not only do your beliefs affect you, but your beliefs affect me because it changes how you treat me as a human being and allows me to either flourish or not flourish. There's this thing called the self-fulfilling prophecy. A teacher's belief in your ability can greatly impact your performance. If your teacher thinks that you are the dumb kid in class, your teacher will behave towards you in a certain way, which will reinforce that belief in you. If your teacher thinks you're a bright person, then they will respond differently to you, and that belief in your ability will come through and it will cause you to perform well as a student. So, negative stereotypes may impact the teacher's belief, which in turn affects their behavior towards students. This can ultimately lead to outcomes predicted by the stereotype. So, what this guy, Robert Rosenthal, did is he went to teachers in elementary school, and I don't know if this is right or wrong, but he would randomly pick kids out of the class and he would have underachievers and overachievers. And what he would do is he would go and tell the students at the beginning of the year, hey, little Robert, we looked at his test scores and we think that little Robert is really going to explode this year. His reading skills, the test scores show that this is going to be a big year for this guy. He is really going to be one of your better students. And then they randomly told the teacher, see this child, Dave, over here. Our test scores show us that Dave is really struggling and not doing well. For some reason, he's behind the other children. He's going to need extra help to catch up. And what Robert Rosenthal found was even though these children had been randomly selected, those that the teacher believed were going to be academically successful really took off and outperformed the other children by a great deal during the course of a school year. All right. And so your teacher's belief in you can actually affect how well you perform in a situation. Sarah Kring says, my fifth grade teacher told me I can't read, so I don't like reading anymore. Absolutely. Why would you do something that you're not good at, right? This authority figure, anytime you struggled, Sarah, instead of saying, well, Sarah's going to get it, your teacher probably blew it off and said, well, Sarah can't read anyhow. And so your teacher didn't help you, which then didn't help you develop this skill. A lot of times, if a teacher believes that you can do it, the teacher's going to put in extra effort trying to help you. Come on, try again. You can get that right answer. You can get that right answer. No, that's close. Keep doing it. and the kid will keep doing the math problem until they get it right. On the other hand, if the teacher believes that the kid's not good at math and the kid gets the wrong answer, the teacher may say, okay, let's move on now. And so they don't help that kid develop their skills. So you're right, Sarah. Your teacher's belief in you can definitely affect the way you perform. And this is why I hate to say it, it was so important for me to get my kids in the gifted and talented program in third grade. Because once your teachers see that little sticker beside your name in fourth grade and fifth grade, your teacher's going to spend more effort trying to help you get it because they have been told that you are a bright student. May not even be the truth, but if it gets your teacher to react to you in such a way that it fosters your ability, right? And so it's not fair, it's not right, but it's unfortunately the way situations are made up. Sometimes your teacher, your bosses, your supervisor's expectations can really subtly affect your performance, right? And this happens when you get teachers that have stereotypical beliefs about this group of students or that group of students. One of the cool things that I've found about being a teacher here at Wake Tech, I teach students from all across the world. I swear to God, I have students from every part of Asia, every part of Europe, every part of Africa, South America, all kinds of Americans. And one of the things that I've found is that stereotypes we have about this group or that group being smarter than other groups is not true. It is absolutely not true. And I found that all groups around the world have smart people and not so smart people. You know, the only ones I would say that really kick butt are those stinking Canadians. I'm not sure what it is about the Canada's school system, but my Canadian students always rock. But you know what? I get students from Asia and Africa that surprise me one way or the other. These stereotypes are not true. But if we have these stereotypes as teachers, we can convey them to our students. Now, if you look at IQ testings, within the history of IQ testing, there has been a consistent difference between some ethnicities' scores on IQ tests. Specifically, Asians score higher than Caucasians, who score higher than African Americans and Hispanic students, right? And so, are we really to believe that Asians are smarter than everyone else? No, I've done enough teaching here at the at Wake Tech that I know that Asians, there are smart ones, but you know what? There are also not so smart ones, and that we all have the same level of intellect. So why do we get these differences between these groups? There are some researchers that have done research specifically within the context of Caucasian versus minority students here in the United States. And one of the reasons they suggest that these students do more poorly is because of stereotype threat. You know what? A stereotype, people have negative stereotypes about their own groups. Now, I know the positive stereotypes about Caucasians, but I also know the negative stereotypes about Caucasians. Just like that, you know the positive stereotypes about African American students and the negative stereotypes about African Americans. You know the positive stereotypes of Asians and the negative stereotypes about Asians. And uh, what's been found is that these stereotypes may affect these IQ tests. And so they've done research where they give IQ tests to African American and Caucasian students. They tell them it's an IQ test, and what you'll see is the standard 10-point difference in the average between the two groups. They tell these people, they give these people the same test, but they tell them, hey, this is a reasoning and creativity test. And what they find is that the difference between these groups go away. And so the idea is that beliefs that we have implanted in our heads by our teachers, by our groups, about beliefs that we should have in about our groups may affect our behavior in the end. And I'm not saying anybody's wrong or right. This is non optimal, but I'm not saying that anybody specifically, individually, is an evil person. What I'm saying is that these beliefs we have about in groups and out groups that become activated in our mind from time to time cause us to change the way we explain why people are successful and false attributions and how we behave towards these people with a way of affecting their behavior. Now, we do all know exactly what old fashioned racism is. And we've all heard the stereotypes of the 1930s here in the United States, or when this group was overtly racist towards another group. And you know what? You are right, and a lot of that is gone. So we don't have people calling other people negative epithets and bad words. We don't have colored water fountains and white colored fountains. We don't have Jim Crow laws. We don't have those old fashioned racist beliefs. Those are gone. But what you do have to pay attention to is that people still have these negative beliefs. They just happen to be a little more subtle and a little more unconscious. And so, if you come to class tonight, we're actually going to look at people's automatic biases towards other groups. So, we're actually going to take this thing called the implicit bias test tonight. And what you're going to find is that you have a lot of implicit beliefs about these groups that you are not aware of. So, men versus women. Are you a person who thinks that women should be nurses or homemakers and men should be business leaders? You may think you don't, but I'll bet you have an implicit belief that is sexist that way. Do you think that African Americans are more aggressive? You may say no, but this implicit bias test is going to show that when you are unconsciously processing information, this bias is underneath you working. And what's going to shock you is how many of these implicit biases you actually have working in a lower level of your brain. Now, when we think about that, social cognition is the branch of psychology that's interested in how we process information through our short term, long term, and sensory memory with an eye towards how these processes are affected by the situation. And what we found is that you can think of bias or what we might call prejudice as being built into the system. Okay, we all have a bias for the in group against the out group. That is automatic. That is automatic. That is built in. I, as a male, have biases against females. It's automatics built into the system because they're the out group. I, as a Caucasian, automatically have biases towards Asians or African Americans because they are in another group. I have these automatic processes going underneath that we all have built into the system, just like you have them. Uh, if you're an Asian person or if you're a female, you have the same automatic biases running under your system. What Banaji and Greenwald say is that some of us learn to control those processes and we engage in more egalitarian thinking. But that is a process that you have to intentionally try to change. I have to say to myself, I am an egalitarian person. I don't think this way about males or females. In fact, about 10 minutes ago, when I was mentioning teacher, I was getting ready to say she. And that's such a sexist thing, saying that the teacher must be she. I actually remember in my head stopping that word from coming out of my mouth and said the teacher instead, because I didn't want to show my bias towards females. And what Banaji and Greenwald show is that when you get people like me who rate as egalitarian and you put their mind under cognitive load, you give them a second thinking thing to do while they're making judgments, their judgments are going to turn out to show this hidden bias that they have. So if you ask me to make judgments about Caucasians and African Americans, and that's the only thing I'm doing, what you're going to see is that my judgments show no bias against African Americans. However, if you say, Chris, I want you to make these judgments, but at the same time you're making these judgments, I'm going to have you be reading out a list of words that are popping through the second screen. So, Chris, you're going to be making judgments, but you're going to be doing something else at the same time. That something else is called a cognitive load. And what Greenwald and Banaji find is that when you put even an egalitarian person under a cognitive load, their prejudice and bias will automatically come back. And so, what I'm trying to say here is I'm not trying to be a pessimist in saying there's nothing we can ever do about racism and prejudice and the world is hopeless and hateful. What I'm trying to say is that you need to understand that we're built in our system to organize the world into groups, groups that we belong to and groups that we don't belong to. And as a general rule, we tend to have patterns of believing towards the out group and in group that are different. We tend to favor the in group. We tend to see the in group as being composed of more varied people. And when given the opportunity, we tend to reward the in group more than the out group. And so, what I'm saying is, we just need to be aware of that tendency as we move through day to day life. Each and every one of us. I'm not saying you're all racist. I'm not pointing at you and saying you're a bad person. I'm saying each and every one of you, male, female, white, Asian, black, green, purple, whatever it is you happen to be, you have these inherent biases that work automatically in your system. And it's always something that you need to be aware of and you need to be taking into account for. Does that make sense? I hope that made some kind of sense. We're going to talk about implicit biases tonight. You will absolutely love it. Okay. Now, our performance is actually affected by group factors. In a more general sense, we can talk about how our behavior is affected by group factors. You know what? Sometimes when you're in front of other people, our performance is impacted. How many of you ever played a sport and had to play a big game in front of a huge audience? Did you get nervous? Did you find your performance was impaired? Or did you rise to the occasion in front of 1,000 people and perform really well? I remember when I played high school football, it was always the biggest audiences of the year. We played Whiteville in the playoffs one time, and there were 6,000 people in the stand. I was so nervous. That was the most people I'd ever played in front of, and they were looking at me. I've taught classes with 300 students before. Have you ever presented in front of 300 people and had 300 people looking at you? These groups affect the way we perform. And research has shown that when we are engaging in something that we know how to do really well, we actually perform better when we're in front of a group of people. So if you're really, really good at something, it's better if you do it in front of a crowd. This phenomenon is known as social facilitation. I thought every last one of them was looking at me in the football game. When I was a teacher, I knew damn well everybody was looking at me. You know, the weird thing is, the first few times I gave lectures, actually the first 100 times I gave lecture, I wasn't really good at lecturing. I was still learning it. It was still a very complex task. And so for me, when I had a lot of students in the room, I had trouble giving lectures. And that's because engaging in a complex task in front of a bunch of people, something that you don't know how to do well, being in front of a bunch of people impairs your performance. It's only when you know how to do something really good that that extra burst of arousal helps you. If you remember, we talked about optimal arousal in last week when we were talking about optimal arousal in sports psychology. The level of arousal depends upon how well you know a task or how simple the task is. If the task is simple or you know it really well, more arousal provides optimal performance. If you are not good at something or it is a really difficult task, it's better to be more relaxed and have less arousal. And so, what we find is that our performance is also maybe impaired or improved depending upon whether or not we're performing in front of a bunch of people. However, take that same person and put them in a collaborative task. Hey, we're all working together to do this group project. We're all working together to pick this acre of fruit or this acre of watermelons. We're all working together to clean this house. Have you ever been in a group task before? You'll often find that in a group task where our performance is combined, that you're going to get what we call social loafing. How many of you have ever been in a group project with somebody that won't do their group work and lets the rest of the group do all the work? You ever had a social loafer in your class, in your group before? Let's be honest. How many of you have ever socially loafed on a group project? How many of you have ever been on a group project and not done your fair share, huh? So sometimes in social facilitation, the output is all yours and you are being judged individually. And then the arousal causes us to perform better. If the output is going to be compared collectively, having a group often makes us work less hard than we normally was. You're right, nobody wants to be the sucker. You're absolutely right. Oh, and I'm running all out of time. Let me finish. And you know what? Sometimes when we're in a group, we lose our sense of individual identity. Sometimes that feeling of being in a group becomes so powerful that you forget to think about yourself as an individual and you will lose your sense of individual morality. Have you ever been at a sports game and you were so caught up in the moment of being a Carolina or a State fan or a Duke fan or an ECU fan or whatever your high school was that you absolutely lost your mind and you started thinking, kill the other team, kill the other team? You know what? Sometimes when we get into a high pressure group situation, we become a mob and we lose our sense of individual morality. And if I become a part of this group, I can actually lose my social constraints sometimes. Mobs are super scary. In fact, the famous sociologist Gustave Le Bon wrote a book called The Crowd in 1895 that is generally considered sort of the beginnings of social psychology. And what he suggests is that individuals oftentimes lose their sense of morals in a group of people. This really cool study was done by a fellow named Diener in 1976. I don't know if you've ever been trick or treating before and saw those people that couldn't be home on Halloween night, so they put their candy in a bowl out in front of their house and say, take just one. Diener did this experiment, but he varied the experiment. Sometimes there was a big mirror behind the candy, and sometimes there wasn't. Now, if there's a big mirror behind the candy, when you're taking the candy, you're having to look at yourself as an individual, right? And some of the kids had masks, and some of the kids did not have masks. And then sometimes the candy didn't have a mirror behind it. And what he found was kids in masks tended to take more candy than kids who weren't wearing masks. And people who had to look at themselves in a mirror took less candy than kids who didn't have to look at themselves in the mirror. And he found that kids who weren't wearing masks, who had to look at themselves in a mirror, took the least amount of candy out of the candy bowl at Halloween. And what he suggested was that looking at yourself really causes you to feel a sense of individual morality. And when you're wearing a mask or you're in a group of people and you're not looking at yourself, you tend to feel more like a group and you will do things that are a little less pro social. Now, and he called this feeling we sometimes get in a mob. If you've ever been in a group of state fans and you wanted to kill those Carolina fans, you have become de-individuated. In large group settings, sometimes collective self takes over and individual morality is forgotten. Leads to bad things. Now, in two quick studies, Stanford Prison Study, this fellow Phil Zimbardo did this really famous study where he in 1970 he found 12 college students that wanted to participate in a 2-week exam. He randomly selected some of them to be prisoners and some of them to be the police. He actually enlisted the school police department, went by and did a false arrest of the 6 prisoners, brought them to the bottom of the psych lab, and put them in a mock prison. And he gave the other 6 individuals, he gave them brown outfits, billy clubs, and mirrored sunglasses, and told them they would be the cops. And what he found was that these people adopted their roles, and the guards became mean and cruel and abusive towards the prisoners. And the prisoners became meek and mild and took the beating and the abuse. And he found that people actually learned to accept the role that they were given. This was a crazy experiment, absolutely. And then finally, this idea of group polarization. Anytime you're in a group of similar minded individuals, the more you discuss something, the more extreme your opinion will be. So if you're a Republican and you get together with your Republican friends, you will begin to think that those Democrats are even loonier than you thought before. If, on the other hand, you are a Democrat and you get together with your Democratic people, you will begin to believe that those Republicans are even more fascist and hateful and racist than you thought they were before. This is known as group polarization. So even when we're in groups, they cause us sometimes to lose our sense of self and to become more extreme in our behavior and our activity. Okay, it is now 9:54. I have spent all of the time that was allotted to me today to talk about how groups affect our behavior. I hope you appreciate, after having been in this lecture today, I want you to appreciate that you are a member of a group for better or for worse. And that sense of groupness does affect the way you make basic decisions about who you are, how you behave, and what other people are. Each and every one of us has the seeds of being prejudicial towards other groups. And so that's something you always need to keep in your mind when you can, to try and make yourself the best human being possible. And just realize that even though you're an individual, you are also a man, an Asian, an African American, a Caucasian, a state student, a North Carolinian, a Southerner. You have these group identities and they have real impacts for what you think, feel, and do. All right, folks, thank you very much for coming today. Have a great day. Tonight, come to class. We are going to be taking the implicit association test, and we're going to be finding out whether or not you have implicit biases towards groups that you didn't even know existed. Hey, have a great day, and I will see you tonight at 8 p.m. Take care.